No,
And I did have the answer for that. My next book is coming out in December, December 2nd. It's called Dangerous Women. It's an anthology I edited with Gardner Dozois, coming out on December 2nd. It's got a 30,000 word novella in it by me called The Princess and the Queen, about the Targaryen Civil War of a couple hundred years before the events of Song of Ice and Fire, as well as some amazing stories by Megan Lindholm, Robin Hobb, and Diana Gabaldon, and Melinda Snodgrass, and Jim Butcher, and Brandon Sanderson, and Joe Abercrombie. The list goes on and on. More than 20 stories about dangerous dames and women warriors and the fairer sex committing mayhem, murder, and other bloody acts. So that's my next book, and it's coming out December 2nd. Yes.
Dangerous Women. Keep an eye out for it. So, well, maybe on that track, what famous women in history? You're obviously a history buff, and what women through history have inspired you and helped you on your way to creating these female characters that we love, as well as the male characters that we love.
Well, actually, there are some very interesting queens in both English and French history who have at least partially inspired some of the characters in Game of Thrones. Many people have observed that Game of Thrones is based, at least in part, on the Wars of the Roses, and that is certainly true. Although I don't do a one-for-one translation. So if you go in there and you say, well, this character is based on that character, you're going to be partly right, but also partly wrong, because I like to mix and match and throw in a few twists and make the characters my own. But certainly the wife of Edward IV, Elizabeth Woodville, was one of the most interesting queens in English history. She was the mother of the princes in the Tower, and married secretly. She was a Lancastrian, but she married the Yorkist claimant secretly, and that produced all sorts of trouble. And she was in the middle of all that stuff with Richard III. She was fascinating. But also on the other side, she was a Yorkist queen, the Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. She was pretty amazing.
Hardcore.
Hardcore, definitely. She was married to the idiot king, Henry VI, and basically had to command her side after some of the leading Lancastrian supporters were killed in the early parts of the war. So those are both interesting characters. And if you go back 100 years before, of course, the wife, Isabel, the wife of King Edward II.
She-Wolf of France.
The She-Wolf of France. She was a pretty amazing one too. She basically, got rid of her husband, the king, imprisoned him, and allegedly had him killed by having a hot poker thrust up his ass.
Yep.
While he was in captivity, and she and her lover took over and ran the kingdom until her son, Edward III, got tired and become of age, and then he rose up against his own mother and imprisoned her. So, all of this stuff that in Games of Thrones, I play with it, but I can't claim to really have invented any of it. It's some of it is amazingly true, and some of the things in history that are just as violent and twisted and bizarre and amazing as anything in my books.
So you are, and just talking about the formation of you, George R. R. Martin, as a person and a writer, you're a classic baby boomer. So you were maturing at a time of great change, social change, of a time of pop art and new art movements and new literary styles, I should say. What influences were there? You're famously a fan of comic books, but what else did you draw from the times when you were maturing?
I was there right for the beginning of the Silver Age of comics, when crime comics and superhero comics rose up again after a decade of having faded away, and the new superheroes introduced by DC, who were mostly old versions of old superheroes, rose to prominence, and then Stan Lee came in with Marvel. My first published words were letters in Fantastic Four, and letter columns, and the Avengers letter column, and places like that, saying things like, basically, Shakespeare, move over, Stan Lee has arrived. But I still go back and look at some of those Marvel comics, and the stuff that Stan Lee did was truly amazing. Those characters were revolutionary. He changed that entire industry, just as Julius Schwartz did, the DC editor who was contemporary. And all of those had a huge impact on me. But I was also reading a lot of science fiction at the time, and later. Robert A. Heinlein was, I read Have Space That Will Travel, the first science fiction book that I ever read, was given to me by a friend of my mother's, and it was one of Heinlein's juveniles. I think the best of Heinlein's juveniles. You can probably make the case as the best of Heinlein's novels. Terrific book, and Heinlein remained my favorite writer for like a decade after that, and I read everything I could get a hold of by him. But I also discovered J.R.R. Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft and a lot of other science fiction writers, Eric Frank Russell and Isaac Asimov, and A. Van Vogt, who I never could quite figure out, and numerous others.
I've discovered that you own a movie theatre, and your first film that you played there was your favourite, which is Forbidden Planet, which...
Forbidden Planet, greatest science fiction movie ever made, still today.
It is The Tempest by Shakespeare, is the base plotline of that.
Basically, yeah, it's a very loose adaptation of The Tempest, obviously, moved to another planet, with Robbie the Robot playing the role of Ariel. And...
why is it so important to you? Why does it stand up to this day in your mind?
Well, obviously, I see a lot of young people in the audience, and they may see Forbidden Planet and not realize what an amazing picture it was, because its special effects and things like that obviously can't compare. It was made in 1956. It can't compare anything that's being made by Jim Cameron or Peter Jackson or any of the people who are making movies today. But the look of the movie was incredibly revolutionary for 1956. It was a big budget science fiction movie by MGM. Science fiction up to that point had largely been what were called B movies. Every movie theater in those days, in the United States anyway, played two movies. And you would always get to see a double feature. You would go to the movies and you would see two movies. They were only, by and large, about 90 minutes long. The average movie ran in those days. And there was always a headline movie, which was the main part of the card, and then there was the B movie. And the science fiction was always the B movie, until MGM decided, well, this is the space age, and we have atomic power, and kids like this space stuff. Let's make a big, because movies were struggling at that time. They were in competition with television. So they decided to put a lot of money behind Forbidden Planet and make something epic. And indeed they did. It had Leslie Nielsen basically playing the role that would be Captain Kirk in a later generation. And everybody today knows him as a comic actor, but this is a straight role for him. Robbie the Robot, which was a revolutionary, best robot ever done. And it was an intelligent science fiction movie. Obviously, part because it was based on Shakespeare, but it was getting at some actual fairly profound stuff. I mean, most of the other science fiction movies of the era, they had monsters in them, but it was sort of, a giant bug got radioactive and now he's eating the city of Cleveland. And, I guess you could consider those things warnings against atomic energy or the atomic bomb, or a symptom of fear of radiation, all of that stuff. There was an underlying message with them frequently that, there are some things man was not meant to know. Science fiction, but with an anti-scientific bent. The aliens would most often come to us. If there were spaceships, it would be very primitive spaceships, like the first spaceship going to the moon, the first spaceship going to Mars. There were a lot of movies made like that. Some of them good, like Destination Moon, which Heinlein had a lot to do with. But Forbidden Planet, was like hundreds of years in the future, and humanity had spread to the stars, and we had, the United Planets, the equivalent of the Federation. I mean, you can look at Star Trek, if any of you are Star Trek fans out there.
I don't know if we'd have any Star Trek fans in.
Roddenberry got everything from Forbidden Planet. I mean, it's all there in Forbidden Planet. I mean, the Federation, which is called United Planets, and the C-57D is clearly the ancestor of the Enterprise. It was a saucer, for one thing, imitating the saucer look of the Enterprise. The basic triad of characters, the captain, the first officer, and the doctor. The personalities were switched around a little here, but it was still there. And of course, the captain wound up with the girl, which later always happens. So you can see that Roddenberry just took Forbidden Planet and ran it. But Forbidden Planet is actually smarter than most of Star Trek. I mean, it's the whole concept of the monster from the id, that we all have this dark side in us, and that if the Krell, the secret of the Krell machine, there's amazing special effects and all that. And it's a movie that I think still holds up today. So I was very happy to show it as the first movie in my movie theater.
Well, you mentioned that movies being in competition with television. You then became a television writer. What was your experiences in that form like? Was it the writing dialogue that drew you to television? Was it the expanded series nature of it?
It was actually the prospect of homelessness that that drew me there. I began selling stories in 1971 and was pretty successful right from the beginning. I sold a lot of stories and didn't write my first novel for 6 years, but by that time I'd sold like 40 stories, and I'd been published in every magazine. I'd been nominated for the Hugo Award, for the Nebula Award. I'd won a Hugo Award, and I did my first novel and got what was for the time a very substantial sum of money for it, and then I got even more for my second novel, even more for my third novel, and even more for my fourth novel. So I had this kind of charmed career as a writer of science fiction and fantasy and horror novels. And my fourth novel, The Armageddon Rag, which was perhaps my most ambitious novel yet, was going to be, my publishers were convinced this was the big one. This was the book that was going to break me out of genre science fiction and make me a household name, a bestseller to, who would be on all lists. The only problem with that is the book failed to best sell. In fact, it failed to sell at all. Nobody bought it, and they put a lot of money, they paid me a lot of money for it, they put a lot of money into advertising and promotion, and then it was a total failure. And publishing, like Hollywood, is an unforgiving business. It's not a, I mean, I know there are undoubtedly some aspiring writers in the room. There always are some aspiring writers, and probably some writers who are even selling a few things. There's a lot to recommend writing as a career, but security is not one of them. If you are someone who requires security, this is not the career for you. Go into accounting. Go into something where you'll get a job at entry level, and then you'll get promoted in a few years, and then you'll get promoted again, and you'll get raises, and ultimately you'll get a gold watch and a nice retirement party. That won't happen when you're a writer. When you're a writer, you'll have wild swings of success, hopefully, if you're lucky, and followed by abject periods of failure. And I had one of those after Armageddon Rag. I thought my career as a novelist was over. I couldn't sell my next book. I wrote 200 pages of it, offered it to my agent. Everybody said, "Oh God, did you see the sales figures on Armageddon Rag? No, this guy is poison." But fortunately, some opportunities in Hollywood came along right at the same time on Twilight Zone, which was just being revised on CBS. The executive producer of that show, Phil Daguerre, loved science fiction and fantasy. I'd met him a couple years ago. And when Phil got that show going, he decided, just like Rod Serling had done on the original Twilight Zone, that he would give script assignments to people who had never written for television and film before and see how they did. And he gave assignments to like a dozen of us, not just me. But I must have done better than the other 11 guys, because they gave me another script assignment and another script assignment. Next thing I knew, I wound up on staff. So just as my career as a novelist was dying, my Hollywood career began, and I was on Twilight Zone for 2 years. I did a couple scripts for Max Headroom, although I was never on staff on that show. And then I wound up on Beauty and the Beast for 3 years. And then 5 years after that, I was doing development, as they call it, or development hell, where I was coming up with my own ideas for shows and doing pilots, writing feature films. Very lucrative period, career-wise. Nothing ever got made, though. So after 5 years, I found that emotionally unsatisfying. But thankfully, by then, I'd socked away a lot of my Hollywood money, and I'd paid off my house. So, which I'd been afraid I was going to lose when Armageddon Rag failed and I couldn't sell my novel. And my God, I had a second mortgage and, lines of equity, and how the hell am I paying my bills here? And I decided I never want to be in debt again. So I got all that stuff cleared away and finally went back to writing novels. And I started this thing called Game of Thrones. You may have heard of it. I know my idea with that was I was sick of Hollywood, so I would write something that would never be filmed or made into a movie. Something really big.
Well done.
Really big with, million characters and battles and complicated plot and all the things that they hate in television. So I didn't have to worry about them ever doing that.
Well, when they came to you, one of my questions here is actually from a chap called Dan B, and his question was, did working on things like The Twilight Zone actually influence your decision to allow A Song of Ice and Fire to go to television as opposed to a film?
Yes.
Excellent, next question.
I had a couple books out, and with the second book in the series, Clash of Kings, made the bestseller list. That was the first time in my life I was on a bestseller list. I was number 13 on the New York Times list for 1 week. But it was still pretty exciting to me because I'd never been on that list before. That's a big, I don't know if you know about it in Australia, but the New York Times is the list you want to be on in America for a bookseller. I guess in England it's the London Times list.
And here it's the Brisbane Times, obviously.
Okay. Just so long as you have Times in the title,
exactly,
I guess
that's all you need.
So Hollywood producers watch the Times list for properties, that's what they call books, properties.
Okay.
They don't call them books or novels, God forbid. So they watch the Times list to see what hot properties might be around that they could acquire and turn into movies. And of course, Peter Jackson had already had some great success with Lord of the Rings. So all the studios in Hollywood were looking for another epic fantasy so that they could replicate. Hollywood is very imitative, if a Western succeeds, everybody wants to do a Western. If a show about jugglers succeeds, everybody wants a show about jugglers. So Lord of the Rings was big. Oh my God, let's get our own Lord of the Rings. We need a Lord of the Rings too, that we can make millions and billions of dollars. So all the studios are running around, all the independent producers are running around, they're looking for other properties. And one studio acquired Narnia, and we got the Narnia films. Another studio acquired the Philip Pullman books, and we got one Philip Pullman films. Various other people acquired rights to Robert Jordan's books and David Eddings' books and Terry Brooks' books. All of these things went into development. And I got a lot of offers because I'd been, on the New York Times list for 1 week as number 13. And I met with some of these people. I had telephone conversations with people, but ultimately I said, this can't be done as a movie. It's too big to be a movie. Movies, you have 2.5 hours. If you go to 3 hours, the studio starts to have kittens and freak out because it's too long. Oh my God, it's 3 hours long. No one can possibly sit still for that. We have to cut the hell out of it. It's 3 hours long. So you got, if you're lucky, you got 2.5 hours. It took 3 movies to do Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings is one book, really. I know they divided it into trilogy, but if you put it all together, as publisher has, it's one book about the same size as My Storm of Swords. So just the 3 books I had published by the time this happening would have taken like 9 movies. And I didn't think they would give me 9 movies. And it was very unusual that they committed, that New Line committed to do the Peter Jackson movies, committed to 3 movies right away and let him film all 3 movies. The much more usual situation is, of course, what happened to Philip Pullman, and well, let's do the first one and see how it does, and then when it's a big hit, we'll do more. And what happens if it's not a big hit? You never get the second movie. And so I didn't think it could be done as movies. So I listened to this, and ultimately I said, no, I don't think I want to sell you the rights. And you know, that's the sexiest word you can say in Hollywood is no. Then they come back to you with more money. And when you say no again, it really drives them nuts. But it did get me thinking, well, okay, I never thought these books would be filmed. In fact, I think these books are unfilmable. But now everybody is contacting me and they're interested in rights. Is there any way to film these books? And it says to me, well, television could do it. A television miniseries, like Roots, you know, Roots had like 27 hours. And some of the great old miniseries of the 70s and 80s, Holocaust, you know, there were a number of them, Rich Man, Poor Man. It was a big, meaty series. Of course, nobody was making miniseries like that in America anymore, so I didn't really think that was viable. I said, well, it could be an ongoing series on a show like, but then I said, there's too much sex, there's too much violence. It can't, it's never going to fly. I mean, I'd worked for CBS on both Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast. I know what they would allow, which was basically nothing. And the books would have been battlerized to hell. You would have gotten a PG-13 rating on these. So I said, no, it can't be done as a network show too. The only way to do these things would be on a premium cable channel, something like HBO. HBO is doing like Rome and Deadwood and The Sopranos, that kind of stuff. Each book has an entire season. Some of the bigger books has 2 seasons. That's the only way you could do it. But I don't have time to do it. I gotta write more books. But I did express this to my agent, and then my agent set up a meeting for me with these 2 guys, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, and who had an idea about how to do the books. And I sat down with him at a meeting at a restaurant in Los Angeles, and they said, we don't think your books can be done as a feature. The only way to do your books is for a series for somebody like HBO. And I said, okay, now I'm listening. Let's talk. And we talked for hours, and you know, the rest is history. They had the same approach that I did, and it was the right approach, and it seems to have worked out well for all concerned.
Wonderful. Well, another question that I've got here with the books, about the books, from Lucas E. On the writing process. Do you sit down and plan out most of the story, characters, world, and major plot points first, or do they come to you as you write?
It's a combination of both. I know the broad strokes of the series, but a lot of the detail I find in the actual course of writing. And sometimes I come up with ideas and notions that are actually cool enough that they change the broad strokes. You know, I don't know where this stuff comes from. It comes from my muse or my subconscious or my right brain or left brain or my brain behind the other brain. But it comes bubbling to the surface, and that's the magical well springs of creativity. But they come when you prime the pump. They come when you're writing, and sometimes they lead you down dead ends and false alleys and mug you when you're not looking, but most of the time they lead you to places you want to go, or at least that's what I've found.
And a follow-up question on that from Lisa C. If you could go back and rewrite any aspect of the series so far, would you change anything, and why?
You know, I've occasionally thought about that. In moments where it seems like I'm juggling so many balls that they're occasionally falling out of the air and hitting me in the head. I do have these moments where I think, did it have to be 7 kingdoms? The 5 kingdoms of Westeros, that would not have been enough, Martin? That has a nice ring, the 5 kingdoms. Let's hear it for the 5 kingdoms. So I think about that. I would certainly go back and correct mistakes, you know. I do make mistakes. I know it's hard for you to believe because I seem such a perfect and infallible fellow, but you know, I think it's, I have, you know, poor Renly, whose eyes were blue in one scene and then green in another, and 314 fans wrote me to point it out. So
That's just an approximate 314.
Then in the second book, I said, yes, Renly, with his blue-green eyes, that seemed to change color depending on the light and what he was wearing. I thought that was very graceful. I also have I have a horse that changes sex between books. It's a mare in one book and a filly in another. I'm not good with sex with horses. So there you are. Well, what the hell? But I would fix things like that. The frustrating things, and you know, I do make mistakes like that. The frustrating things about making mistakes like that is because they create the possibility in my readers that other inconsistencies that they notice are also mistakes. And I don't want that inconsistency, because there are some inconsistencies in the book that are not mistakes, that are deliberately planted there, very carefully planted there, because I'm using devices like the unreliable narrator, since I'm dealing with a third person, but a tight point of view. You're inside people's heads. So when you get, you know, I do also get letters, besides the people who point out the blue-green eyes, who say, well, wait a minute, you said this in a Tyrion chapter, but then later in a Jon Snow chapter, you said something that contradicts it. So you made a mistake. No, I didn't make a mistake. That was deliberate. There was two different characters with different perceptions of the same thing here, and that was very intentional. Some of the stuff I do with battles, where you'll notice there's inconsistencies in the number of people involved. Again, very deliberate. I've read a lot of history. You know, you read about, for example, the Battle of Agincourt, and you know, in the French accounts of the Battle of Agincourt, they both sides agreed that the English won. In the French version, it's like 5,000 Englishmen defeated 6,000 Frenchmen. In the English versions, 150 Englishmen defeated 300,000 Frenchmen, and the Englishmen were only armed with fruit knives. So, you know, you get very different, very different chronicles reporting things. So that the size of a medieval army, is it 20,000 people? Is it 30,000 people? Is it 40,000? You may see in the books wildly different estimates of like how many wildlings they are, or how many people are in Lord Tywin's host and all that. I'm just trying to replicate some of the truths of medieval history here, and give it that kind of real verisimilitude of the times.
Wonderful. Another one here, a question, a bit of a left field question, but from Sarah C. I read an article that suggested the pet turtles you kept as a child are one of the things that helped you create A Song of Ice and Fire. Is that true?
Well, that was the turtles were certainly the first fantasy I ever wrote. When I was just in grade school, probably 7 years old, 8 years old, I was writing the Chronicles of Turtle Castle. You see, I lived in the projects in Bayonne, the low-income projects. Our family had no money, and the projects had very strict rules about pets. You were not allowed to have dogs or cats if you lived in a project. You could be evicted if they caught you with a dog or a cat in your apartment. So, you know, like all kids, I wanted pets, and what I was allowed to have was turtles. And you could go, at that time in the United States, you could buy these baby red-eared turtles at dime stores, as we called them, 5 and 10s, Woolworths, Kresge's, stores like that, and they would come in these little plastic bowls with a divider down the middle and gravel on one side and water on the other and a plastic palm tree in the middle. And you get the bowl and the turtle for, 27 cents or some ridiculous thing here. So I got a bunch of the turtles, and I had a Marx castle, toy castle, Marx tin litho castle that I had on top of the desk in my bedroom. And as it happened, those little turtle bowls, 2 of them fit perfectly inside the castle yard. So that's where I kept my turtle bowls and my turtles. So it was natural, since they were turtles who lived in the castle, I started calling it Turtle Castle, and they were all knights, and one of them was the king, and the others were all knights, and so forth. And the other thing about these little turtles that they sold you back in the 1950s was that they died very easily. They were not long-lived pets. They were, I don't think we really knew enough about the care and feeding of little baby turtles. They gave you some kind of little shakers of turtle food that you were supposed to give them and all that. But, you know, one morning you'd have them for like a month or a month and a half, and then one morning you'd wake up and their eyes would all be sunk in and they'd be dead there, and or the shells would start going soft. You know, I don't know what the hell turtle diseases were happening. And sometimes they would escape the bowls and then escape the castle, and then you wouldn't know where the hell they were. Usually they would turn up under the refrigerator months later. I don't know what drew the turtles across several rooms to the refrigerator. It was like the land of Mordor for turtles. And they would go there, and you know, you do not simply walk under the refrigerator. You never come out. But I didn't want to like blame myself. I loved my turtles. I didn't want to blame myself for killing my turtles through that. So I decided that since they were all dying, they were obviously like killing each other in order to compete for the throne of the Turtle Castle. And the king had. I found the king dead, and who would be the king? This other one would be the king. He must have plotted at the death of the last king. So I started inventing all these stories about the wars and the schemings and things of Turtle Castle. So yes, in a sense, it was the original Game of Thrones. All the parts were played by turtles.
And is Sean Bean as good? Was he as good as a turtle?
Just try when you have your sessions later here with Lena and Marquetti and Jerome Flynn. Just try to imagine all of them with big shells on their backs.
Well, we do have to finish shortly, but I just thought to wrap up, I would ask, we saw the trailer for season 4 Game of Thrones, and obviously I imagine a lot of people here are looking forward to it.
I didn't see it. I was backstage. They didn't show it backstage.
Well, do you, do you sit down and watch the show live?
More and more common, where people get the DVDs of a show like Game of Thrones, or a show directly made for DVD like Netflix recently did with House of Cards, and they sit down and they watch 12 hours in a row. So if the story is powerful enough, that those 3 hours or those 4 hours or those 5 hours will go past like that. And I think a lot of these 4-hour packets that we send out for critics, the critics and the other people who are lucky enough to get them sit down and they watch all 4 hours one after another.
That is correct. It's what we do.
Yeah.
And then you gloat a bit on social media about how you have the DVD, but you can't possibly share any details.
That's right. That's right.
So it is good that you get that kick, seeing the reaction as it happens to things that you've written many years ago.
Yeah. It's always a little nervous-making, especially the episodes that I haven't seen. How's it going to come out? I mean, we have a great staff, and we have a great cast and crew, and David and Dan are doing amazing jobs. But still, the process of adaptation is a difficult process. You always kind of lose things along the way. Things get changed. Sometimes I'm surprised by what's on the screen. Even in episodes that I have myself written, like the Blackwater episode, which was my script for the most part. But at the beginning of that episode is this just marvelous scene between Jerome Flynn and as Bronn and the Hound, played by Rory McCann. The two of them arguing in a brothel. That was not in the books. That was not in my script. David and Dan added that at some point in the production process. So it was as new to me as it was to the audience, but it was a terrific piece of business. So I get that sort of kick, just as you guys do watching it.
We have to wrap up there. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a huge round of applause and thank you to Mr. George R. R. Martin. Thank you, George.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. George will be doing more signings and another chat tomorrow. So another round of applause for George R. R. Martin. Thank you so much.